Hey, welcome to Not Your Inspiration, the podcast where I ramble about disability. My name is Gray and I'm the host of this shit show. And today I want to talk about kind of the mourning process when you go from able-bodied to disabled. I also want to say that I was very reluctant to do this episode. It was requested by two separate people, and my first reaction was absolutely not, because I would have to talk about my personal experiences, and I don't want to do that. But I realized that there's so little out there kind of about that transition and that process and that grieving process, frankly. And I figured might as well bite the bullet and talk about it. So I do want to say that this is going to feature more of my own personal experiences and less objective facts because, I only have one body and I've only become disabled one time. I wasn't born disabled. Some people are, and they never go through this grieving process, or they go through a very different grieving process. And I don't want to speak on that because it's not my experiences. So if you don't really want to hear about personal experiences, then maybe jump ahead an episode. That said, I think something that really is not talked about, even within the disability community, is how hard it can be to go from able-bodied to disabled. And everyone has such a different experience with that. Some people are born disabled, and at some point they realize that most people aren't disabled. Other people, it's a slow, gradual process where they become more and more symptomatic until they're considered disabled. For some people, they just wake up one morning and they're disabled. Other people might be in an accident, a car accident, a surfing accident, any type of accident. So there's not one mold of, this is how you go from able-bodied to disabled. So it's hard to talk about. And I think the important thing when talking about this topic is to respect other people's personal experiences. That's always important, but especially with something that's so different from person to person, it's imperative. I don't really want to speak on people who are born disabled just because that's not my personal experience and I don't want to put words in other people's mouth. So this episode is going to be targeted at people who went from able-bodied to disabled. I just want to put that disclaimer out there. I want to say you're allowed to grieve. It's hard. You're allowed to think that it's shitty, that it's uncomfortable, that it sucks. That doesn't mean you wallow forever. It doesn't mean you hate yourself. But there's kind of this thing, this expectation that you're positive all the time, and people will definitely throw platitudes your way and advice that you don't want, and they'll tell you how to think and act and how to be positive. And I'm not saying that disability is a bad thing or a negative thing, but there are bad and negative aspects to it. There are uncomfortable aspects to it. And it's really, really hard to lose something as important to yourself as health or ability. And there's often not the space and time and support system in place to really, truly grieve that. A lot of times people will tell you that you're just being bitter, or that you'll be fine, or you'll be healed, or to just get over it. There are so many things that people will say, and none of it really matters. It's okay to grieve. It doesn't make you a bad activist. It doesn't make you a bad disabled person. It just makes you a human being who lost something. And that is how I describe it. I describe it as grieving for your health, mourning for your lost abilities, because that's what it feels like. First, there's denial. No, this can't be it. I'm not this person. I don't fit this identity. And then there's anger. Why me? Why did this happen? It's not fair. And there's bargaining. Okay, well, maybe I can have this ability, even though I lost this one. And then eventually, there's acceptance. I skipped depression. I forgot depression. I don't know my 5 stages of grief. I'm not a psychologist. I just play one on this podcast. But there is depression. There's, what's the point? What's the point of living like this? And then there's acceptance. And a lot of times what we see in media, and by the way, I don't want to say names because I don't want to be sued, but you all know the movie I'm talking about. A lot of times what we see in media is we see the denial and the anger and the bargaining and the depression, and it just stays on the depression and it just wallows there. And I think that's when you see disabled characters in the media killing themselves. That's not real life. Real life is not like that. Real life is not a Hollywood movie written by and for able-bodied people. There is depression. There's anger. There's resentment. There's all of those things. It's okay to feel all of those things. But there's also happiness. There's also a newfound community. There's a new life. It gets better. And I don't mean that in a weird platitude-y way, like you'll be up and walking or you won't have any pain. That's not what I mean. What I mean is you'll figure it out. Humans are amazing at adapting to things. We can survive anything. And whatever it is, you're going to survive this too. And you're not just going to survive it, but you're going to thrive. You're going to find a new life and a new purpose. And I don't mean that in a weird, like, overcome your disability kind of way. I mean it in, like, don't let yourself sink so far into the depression that you think you're worthless. Because you're not. You're allowed to be depressed and angry and bitter. You're allowed to hate the world and allowed to hate able-bodied people. Believe me, I'm there with you. But it doesn't mean that your body is worthless. It means that it's a change that you have to mourn. It means that society is fucked up. But it doesn't mean that you as a person don't have value anymore. That's bullshit. And I know that's the rhetoric that's forced so deep into our brains. And I know one person saying it's bullshit isn't going to change anything overnight. But I promise it's not true. Worth is not based on your ability to walk or get dressed or anything. And I feel like there's kind of this independence myth. Like if you can't live alone and you can't cook for yourself or bathe yourself, then you're less human. And it's interesting because I think if you went into, say, a philosophy classroom and you asked a group of philosophy students what makes a person a human, they'd have all sorts of different answers. The ability to love or eating, I don't know what their answers would be. But they'd have answers. And I would argue that none of them would answer, oh, well, what makes a person a human being is their ability to get dressed themselves or their ability to take a shower themselves. That's not what makes a human being a human being. Needing help is okay. And there's this huge, like, independence myth in society. Like, if you can't do certain things, you're less than. And I know where it came from. It came from capitalism. It doesn't make you less of a person to need help. It doesn't make you less of a person to not be able to do things. You have limits. There are things that you're not going to be able to do. That's all right. We all have limits. I mean, able-bodied people have limits too, but we're not talking about them. If your limits are, I can't walk more than a block, or if your limits are, I can't get out of bed without help, you're just as human. Always. Becoming disabled is such a strange and confusing process. And I think right now, personally, I'm at a point where I'm comfortable with it, where I've found a new identity. I've met amazing friends through it. I've met friends in waiting rooms at hospitals, and we're still in touch. I've met friends online. I've made amazing friends through this community. That said, it doesn't start out that way. When it starts, for me, I want to talk about me, I don't want to talk about other people. For me, when I became disabled, I didn't know anything at all about disability. I was really, really ableist, to be completely honest. Not intentionally. I was 12 when I became disabled. So the ideas in my head were the ideas that society puts in all children's head. I didn't personally know any disabled people. I had no reason to question those ideas. And so when I became disabled, those ideas were the only things I had. I didn't know that there was this whole community. I didn't know that you could live a full life. I didn't know that it was okay to have limits, that it was okay to be disabled. I thought either you were disabled, which was bad, or you've cured yourself, which was great. And of course, that's a horrible, flawed way of thinking, and it made me extremely depressed and anxious. It led to a lot of issues, but that's the mindset that I was in. And I don't blame myself for that. I was a kid, and even if I wasn't, those are the ideas that society puts in our heads. And until you're in a position where you have to question those ideas, very few people do question those ideas. When I became disabled, it was kind of half of it was sort of an overnight thing where I just woke up one morning disabled, and the other half of it was a long time brewing. I have many diagnoses, and I don't want to get into all of them, but for me, it started with severe nerve damage. And at first I was on crutches, and it moved to a wheelchair. In the process, I was diagnosed with other things that I had had all my life. So for me, one of my many conditions is genetic, so I was born with it. But I was pretty asymptomatic until about the age of 9 or 10. And at that age, I was symptomatic, but I didn't have a diagnosis. We just assumed that I was kind of an unhealthy kid. And that, I don't know, they just have a weak immune system or a weak body. We didn't know there was some underlying cause until much later. When I started using a wheelchair, I didn't identify with it. I thought that if I thought of myself as disabled, that was somehow giving up. I thought that in my mind, that if I said I'm a wheelchair user, that was somehow labeling myself and trapping myself in this mentality. Of course, I got past that, but it took a long time. It took years. Through all of the surgeries and all of the doctors, all of the mobility aids and the accessibility issues, the moving spaces because where I was living wasn't accessible, all of that. Through all of that, I thought, this is temporary. This'll pass. And I thought that if I thought of myself as disabled, that was it. That was the end. I was no longer human. I was no longer worth anything. I was no longer worth the money that it took to go to all the doctors, or my family's affection, or my friends' time and empathy. I don't really know how I got out of that, but I genuinely credit the cripple punk movement on Tumblr with helping me. When I found that movement, I realized that I could have these emotions and still be proud and still be prideful. It made me feel human again. And what I realize now is you can have emotions that are like, I hate this, I don't like being sick, or I wish that I could skateboard, or anything. And at the same time that you have those emotions, you can also say, I'm proud of this. This is part of my identity. There's nothing wrong with it. And I'm proud of it. You can take pride in yourself and love yourself, and also despise a circumstance at the same time. Those things can coexist. And people don't really tell us that those things can coexist. They kind of say that either you have to completely hate yourself, or you have to be positive and love yourself and be an activist every single minute of every single day. And that's just not how it works. Humans are complex. We're all walking paradoxes. None of us are just one or the other. And I think that black and white thinking is what made me so depressed. When I realized that I could have both of those things inside of me, a desire to be healthy, a want to get better, and also be proud of where I am, and love myself, and have pride in myself, and find a lovely community to help me through it, when I realized that both of those things could coexist, I was a new person. And by the way, when I say get better, I don't mean it in the sense that able-bodied people mean it. I don't mean 100% cured and totally able-bodied and healthy. I mean reaching certain goals, like, I don't know, being able to go to Europe, or, I don't know, I'm trying to think, but it's a very different way of putting it. And some people don't want that. Some people are completely content with where they are, and other people are out there at the forefront of research for a cure of their disabilities. And I think both of those things are totally fine as long as we're careful not to push it on others. If someone doesn't want to see another doctor in their life, then that is totally okay. And if someone donates millions and millions of dollars to find a cure for their disability, that's also okay. But if the person who's looking for a cure says that every single person needs to be cured, or if the person who never wants to see a doctor again says no one's allowed to see a doctor, that's where the problem is. That being said, I can sit here and talk about, how great it was to find a community and how these emotions can coexist. But when you're going through the grief, when you're in the middle of losing the body and independence that you once had, there's nothing that anyone can say that will make it better. There's nothing anyone can say that will take that pain away. So I just want to say, if anyone listening to this just recently became disabled or is struggling with grieving for their past life, I want to say, it's okay. You're allowed to feel that way. It hurts like hell. It's awful. But it'll pass. Those feelings will pass. No one ever told me that. I didn't realize that what I was feeling was normal because the only media that I had was of disabled people being happy, positive, overcoming their disabilities. You can live a good life without overcoming shit. The grief passes. It's not forever. It's intense. It's hard to deal with. It's lonely. Able-bodied people very rarely understand it, and it's a different experience for everyone. Some people block it out and they don't feel it until years later. Other people barely feel it at all, ever. And other people deal with it for years and years. It's not the same for everyone. Some people might not even call it grief. That's my word. Some people might think of it as a change. They might think of it as rage that they're feeling. I don't know. I'm not other people. It's also not talked about within the disability community very much. What's talked about is taking pride in our disabilities and being okay being disabled. And that's great. But I think it's really important that people have an outlet and a space to talk about that grief, to talk about missing being able-bodied, to talk about the things that they miss from their past life. It's okay to talk about those things. It doesn't make anyone a bad activist. It doesn't make anyone a bad disabled person. On that note, I want to wrap this up. If you're listening to this on YouTube, subscribe. It is really helpful. If you are listening to this on the podcast app, consider leaving a review. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this objectively bad, low-budget podcast. As always, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time.